The winter of 1951 remains alive in my memory, even after 70 years. George Pierce, survivor of the 1st United States Marine Division, Korea taught us lessons about human endurance that no military manual could have predicted. We were too young to fully understand what lay ahead. I was only 19 when I was deployed to Korea, full of patriotic ideals and that naive sense of invincibility that only youth provides. Our unit was stationed near the Chosin Reservoir, a name that to this day makes my bones freeze when I say. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. A different silence to the one we usually experience during routine patrols. It was November, and the cold was already beginning to show its merciless claws. Our unit, made up of 150 men, was tasked with defending a strategic position on the hills surrounding the reservoir. I remember Sergeant Martinez, a veteran of the Second World War, always warning us about the subtle signs of the battlefield. The enemy doesn't come out of nowhere, he used to say. First comes silence, then hell. Never had his words made more sense than on that fateful night. Our equipment was basic: M1 Garand rifles, a few Browning .30 machine guns, and a limited number of hand grenades. The cold was our first enemy, with temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius. Fingers froze, even inside gloves, and the metal of the weapons stuck to exposed skin like red-hot iron. It was during one of these freezing nights that the attack began. First, we heard a distant sound, like thunder rolling through the mountains. It was the sound of thousands of boots marching towards us. The Chinese volunteer army had decided that this would be the night to eliminate us. Martinez quickly organized our defenses. We divided the men into 3 main groups, establishing points of resistance on the hills that would give us some tactical advantage. Our supplies were scarce. We had ammunition for perhaps 2 days of intense combat, and rations were running low. The first assault came like a human wave. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of Chinese soldiers advancing towards us. The sound of their war horns echoed through the valley, a sound that still wakes me up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. Our machine guns opened fire, creating gaps in the mass of advancing soldiers, but for every man who fell, 2 seemed to take his place. The night turned into a nightmare of explosions, screams, and the constant crackle of rifles. The air was so cold that the smoke from the shots froze almost instantly, creating a ghostly mist over the battlefield. Our men were fighting not only the enemy, but the very weather that threatened to paralyze our movements. Young Jimmy Collins, a boy from Tennessee who had barely turned 18, was standing next to me when a Chinese grenade fell near our position. Without hesitation, he threw himself on it. His sacrifice saved at least 5 of us. But the image of his serene face, even in that final moment, never left me. Martinez coordinated our defense with the precision of a maestro conducting a deadly orchestra. He ordered the deployment of men and resources, maximizing every bullet, every grenade we had left. "Save ammunition," he would shout between bursts. "Make every shot count." The hours dragged on like days. The intense cold began to take its toll as guns jammed. Men developed hypothermia, and our already scarce medical supplies were quickly consumed. Still, we held our ground, not out of glory or heroism, but because there was simply no alternative. During a brief pause in the attacks, I managed to look down into the valley below. The battlefield was covered in bodies, both Chinese and American, all equally motionless under the white blanket of snow that was beginning to fall. War has this peculiar characteristic of equalizing all men in its final outcome. That night marked only the beginning of our ordeal. In the days that followed, we would face even greater challenges, more painful losses, and moments of courage that defy any rational explanation. But it was there, in those first hours of desperate combat, that I truly understood the meaning of the word survival. The full moon illuminated the battlefield with a pale, indifferent light, silently bearing witness to our struggle for survival. The sound of the Chinese bugles continued to echo through the mountains, foreshadowing more waves of attacks that would come with the certainty of dawn. As the night progressed, the Chinese attack showed no signs of abating. Sergeant Martinez had instructed us to ration ammunition, but the cruel reality of war forced us to fire almost continuously. Every soldier in our position knew that if we ran out of bullets, our fate would be sealed. Between the bursts of gunfire and explosions, I thought of Mary, my fiancée whom I had left behind in Kansas. Her letters, kept in the inside pocket of my jacket next to my heart, were my only connection to a world that seemed more and more distant. The paper was already worn from folding and unfolding, but her words still gave me the strength to carry on. "Pierce, we need to reinforce the left flank." Martinez's voice brought me back to brutal reality. I dragged myself through the snow towards the new position, feeling the extra weight of the equipment and the fatigue that was beginning to overwhelm my muscles. The cold had become our most persistent enemy, turning every movement into a battle against nature itself. Rodriguez, a young man from Puerto Rico who had never seen snow before this mission, was shivering uncontrollably next to me. His lips were blue, and his words came out slurred. "No, I can't feel my feet anymore, Pierce." I quickly guided him to move his toes inside his boots and share my extra socks. We couldn't afford to lose any more men to frostbite. The waves of Chinese attack followed a pattern that we began to recognize. They advanced to the sound of bugles, shouting words in their language that we didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in its intensity. Our line of defense responded with concentrated fire, turning the white snow into a dark carpet of fallen bodies. During a brief moment of calm, Martinez gathered the squad leaders together. Our supplies were reaching a critical level. The ammunition, which should have lasted a week, had been used up in a matter of hours. The coffee we kept in our canteens was frozen, and rations were too scarce to keep our men adequately fed in the extreme cold. "We need to hold this position until dawn," Martinez explained, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Command has promised reinforcements as soon as the weather improves to allow for air support." We looked at each other, knowing that promise might never come true. The weather in Korea was unpredictable, and low clouds often prevented air operations. That's when we heard a different sound coming from the enemy lines. The Chinese were positioning mortars. The first shell fell about 50 meters from our position, raising a column of snow and frozen earth. "Take cover," shouted Martinez, but in our precarious position, shelter was a relative concept. The next few minutes were an inferno of explosions and screams. Each mortar impact shook the ground beneath our feet, throwing deadly shrapnel in all directions. Wilson, our radio man, was able trying to establish contact with command. His blood dyed the snow red as Rodriguez and I rushed to catch up with him. The night seemed endless. The cold intensified the pain of every wound, no matter how small. Our medications were running out, and the unit's doctor, Dr. Harrison, had to make impossible choices about who could receive the last painkillers. Between attacks, I began to notice subtle changes in the enemy's behavior. They seemed to be regrouping in a different way, possibly preparing for a final assault. Martinez also noticed and began to strategically reposition our last hand grenades. "If they break through our line," Martinez said with surreal calm, "use your bayonets. Every man we hold here is one less attacking our other positions." His words reminded us of the responsibility we carried. We weren't just fighting for our lives, but for the survival of the entire American force in the region. The temperature continued to drop, and the biting wind brought with it tiny ice crystals that felt like needles on our exposed skin. Some of the younger men began to show signs of confusion, a dangerous symptom of hypothermia. We kept each other alert through forced conversations and constant movement, knowing that to stop would mean certain death. As dawn approached, our situation became increasingly desperate. Ammunition was critically low, and each man knew exactly how many shots he had left. We counted each bullet as if they were the last drops of water in the desert. The darkness around us seemed to pulse with the presence of the enemy, who continued their relentless pressure on our positions. The sound of Chinese bugles echoed through the valley again, announcing what would be their biggest attack yet. Martinez looked at each of us with an expression I'll never forget. a mixture of steely determination and solemn acceptance of what was to come. "Remember, boys," he said, "we are United States Marines. We don't back down. We don't surrender." Dawn never seemed so far away as it did that night. With our ammunition almost exhausted and the cold penetrating to our bones, each minute dragged on like an eternity. The Chinese attack that Martinez had predicted came with even greater ferocity than the previous ones. "Save your ammunition. Let them get closer." The sergeant's voice echoed through the defensive line as we watched the mass of enemy soldiers advancing up the slope. Our position gave us a tactical advantage, but the overwhelming number of attackers was beginning to make this advantage insignificant. Rodriguez, still fighting against the cold, managed to establish a small protective fire to melt snow and provide water for the wounded. Dr. Harrison worked tirelessly, using pieces of uniform as makeshift bandages. Our medical supplies had long since run out, and with each new casualty, our situation became more precarious. A particularly close explosion threw dirt and snow over our position. Martinez was hit by shrapnel in the shoulder, but refused medical attention. "Take care of the others first," he insisted, pressing a piece of cloth against the wound. His determination was inspiring, but I could see the pain in his eyes. The next few hours turned into a nightmare of hand-to-hand combat. When we ran out of ammunition, we resorted to bayonets. The sound of steel against steel was mixed with screams and explosions, creating a macabre symphony of war. Each man was fighting not only for his own life, but for the survival of the entire unit. It was during one of these clashes that I lost Davis, my best friend since basic training. He was just a few meters away from me when a machine gun burst hit him. There were no dramatic last words, just a final look that I will carry with me forever. War doesn't give us time for proper goodbyes. Martinez reorganized our defense, concentrating the remaining men at key points. We used the frozen bodies and snow as additional protection, a grotesque necessity that the war had imposed on us. The cold had become so intense that the weapons were beginning to fail, requiring constant maintenance to prevent them from jamming. "Pierce, I need you at the high point," ordered Martinez. As I moved to the new position, I observed our situation with growing concern. Of the 150 men who had begun the defense, less than half were still in fighting condition. The others were dead, wounded, or incapacitated by the extreme cold. The change in enemy tactics was sudden and unexpected. Instead of the frontal attacks that had characterized the night, they began to infiltrate from the flanks, taking advantage of our diminished capacity for cover. Martinez noticed the maneuver and ordered an urgent regrouping. "Form a circular perimeter," his hoarse voice cut through the freezing air. "Don't let them divide us." The reorganization was carried out under heavy fire, every move calculated to maximize our limited cover. Rodriguez, despite the cold that still plagued him, proved to be an exceptional marksman, taking out several infiltrators with surprising accuracy. The sky was beginning to lighten when we heard the sweetest sound possible, the distant rumble of airplane engines. The promised reinforcements were finally arriving. P-51 Mustang planes appeared through the low clouds, their machine guns bringing momentary relief to our besieged position. But war is relentless in its twists and turns. The air support, while welcome, also drew heavier enemy artillery fire. Explosions began to fall with frightening precision, forcing us to take even more cover in our precarious positions. Martinez, still bleeding but undeterred, organized a final ammunition count. 15 rounds per man, he announced grimly. "Make every shot count." We handed out the last grenades, saving some for a last resort that no one wanted to contemplate. The snow began to fall again, thick and merciless. Visibility was drastically reduced, turning shadows into potential threats. The sound of the Chinese horns continued, closer now, mixing with the howl of the wind. Each man knew that the next few hours would determine not only our fate, but possibly the course of the battle throughout the region. Dr. Harrison approached my position, his face marked by exhaustion and concern. "The wounded won't last much longer in this cold," he whispered. "We need urgent evacuation." I looked down at the valley below, now a white graveyard of broken dreams and promises. knowing that our situation was becoming increasingly desperate. War has a unique way of revealing the true nature of men. At that moment, surrounded by a determined enemy and facing extreme conditions, I saw both heroism and despair. Each soldier carried his own internal battle, fighting not only the visible enemy, but the fear, cold, and exhaustion that threatened to consume us. Air support from the P-51 Mustang gave us a brief moment of hope, but we soon realized that our situation was still critical. The enemy artillery explosions had created deep craters in the snow, turning our defensive position into a maze of ice and destruction. "Half the ammunition!" shouted Martinez, his pale face contrasting with the dried blood on his uniform. His shoulder wound had worsened, but he continued to lead with the same unwavering determination. I watched as he crawled between the positions, distributing the last cartridges with calculated precision. Rodriguez, who had finally adapted to the brutal cold, became our eyes in the darkness. His keen eyesight detected movements in the shadows that others missed. "Pierce, 3 o'clock, he whispered urgently, pointing to a group of Chinese soldiers trying to flank our position. Dr. Harrison had turned a small natural shelter into a makeshift infirmary. The smell of blood and antiseptic mixed with the icy air. "We need to evacuate Wilson and Jenkins," he informed me in a low voice. "They won't survive another night here." Helplessness in the face of our companions' suffering was an additional torture. The next few hours were a test of physical and mental endurance. The cold had become so intense that breathing hurt, and the metal of our weapons burned to the touch even through our gloves. We used melted snow to cool the barrels of the machine guns, which overheated with constant use. Martinez gathered the survivors for a quick council. "Command reports that reinforcements are on the way, but we need to hold out for another 24 hours. His words were met with a heavy silence. We all knew that every hour would be an eternity of combat and suffering. A new Chinese tactic emerged with the sunrise. They began using smoke mortars, creating dense curtains that obscured our vision. The sound of the bugles now came from multiple directions, a clear attempt to confuse our perception of their real positions. "Save your ammunition," ordered Martinez. "Fire only when you have confirmed targets." Every shot had to count. Every grenade had to cause as much damage as possible. Our survival depended on this brutal efficiency. The snow began to fall again, thick and merciless. The wind howled through the positions, carrying with it the distant sound of fighting in other sectors. We were just a small part of a much larger battle, but at that moment, our little patch of frozen ground was the whole world. Rodriguez set up a rotation system to allow the men to warm up briefly in the makeshift shelter. 3 minutes per soldier, no more than that. It was little, but it made the difference between maintaining the ability to fight or succumbing to the paralyzing cold. A particularly ferocious attack came at midday. The Chinese had managed to position heavy machine guns, and the volume of fire they poured on our positions was terrifying. Martinez ordered us to burrow even deeper into the snow, using the frozen bodies and destroyed equipment as additional protection. "Pierce, I need you to lead a counterattack team," Martinez shouted over the deafening noise of battle. "We have to silence those machine guns, or we'll be massacred." I selected 4 men, including Rodriguez, for the suicide mission. We crawled through the snow, taking advantage of the smoke cover from the enemy mortars. The cold had frozen the sweat on our clothes, turning every movement into an exercise in agony. Rodriguez led the way, his experience in close combat proving invaluable. The counterattack was swift and brutal. We used our last grenades to create confusion, then attacked with bayonets and combat knives. The melee was savage, primitive, a clash of wills rather than skills. We lost Mason during the attack, but managed to silence the machine guns. On returning to our lines, we found Martinez organizing a new defensive line. The number of combatants had dropped dramatically, but each survivor was fighting with the strength of 10 men. Desperation had turned into an iron determination to survive, to not let the sacrifice of our comrades be in vain. Dr. Harrison continued his tireless work with the wounded, now using pieces of dead soldiers' uniforms as makeshift bandages. Every minute we keep them alive is a chance of rescue, he repeated, his hands shaking with exhaustion as he worked. The afternoon turned into an endless succession of attacks and counterattacks. The constant sound of gunfire and explosions had become so commonplace that the moments of silence were more disturbing. The cold remained our most implacable enemy, penetrating every layer of clothing, freezing every drop of sweat. Martinez, despite his increasingly serious injury, remained a force that held our unit together. His constant presence, his clear orders, and his unwavering courage gave us the strength to keep fighting when every instinct screamed to give up. As the day progressed, a new threat appeared on the horizon, dark clouds that promised more snow and even lower temperatures. Our battle was far from over, and the coming night promised even greater challenges than those we had already faced. As night approached again, our situation had become even more precarious. Of the ammunition we had left, each man had only a handful of cartridges. Martinez, whose shoulder wound was now showing signs of infection, gathered the survivors together for a final count. 32 men in fighting condition, he announced in a hoarse voice. 17 seriously wounded under Dr. Harrison's care. I looked at our reduced perimeter, now no bigger than a soccer field, surrounded by destroyed equipment and frozen bodies that we used as makeshift barricades. Rodriguez had developed an ingenious system of communication using hand signals, allowing us to coordinate our defense without revealing our positions through voices. It was amazing how the young man who was shivering with cold a few hours ago had become one of our most valuable assets. A familiar sound cut through the air, the distinctive ringing of incoming mortars. "Cover!" I shouted, diving into the snow as the explosions rocked our position. Dr. Harrison worked frantically to protect the wounded, using his own body as a shield when necessary. Martinez crawled over to my position, his face a mask of determination despite the obvious pain. "Pierce, I need you to lead a reconnaissance mission. We need to know if the Chinese are preparing for another mass attack." I nodded, knowing that this could be a suicide mission. I selected Rodriguez and 2 other survivors to accompany me. We moved silently through the darkness, using the falling snow as natural cover. The cold had become so intense that breathing hurt, and every movement required a conscious effort to overcome the stiffening muscles. As we approached the enemy lines, our worst fears were confirmed. The Chinese were concentrating their forces for a final assault. I counted at least 3 times as many men as in their previous attacks, along with a significant number of mortars and heavy machine guns. On our return to our position, we found Dr. Harrison struggling to save yet another life. Jenkins, one of the seriously wounded, had developed gangrene in his frozen leg. The doctor was working with the few instruments he had left, his movements precise despite the impossible conditions. "How long until dawn?" asked Martinez when I reported our findings. 3 hours, maybe 4, I replied, watching the overcast sky. Every minute seemed like an eternity, marked by the distant sound of Chinese horns and the constant moaning of the wind. Our last hope lay in the promised reinforcements, but time was running out fast. The radio, damaged by shrapnel, barely worked, providing only static fragments of distant communications. Rodriguez managed to pick up a partial transmission, suggesting that a task force was trying to reach our position. Martinez gathered the men together for one last piece of advice. "Each of you has proven your worth 10 times more than any soldier should need to," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and resignation. "Now, we need to decide, do we fight to the last man or attempt a strategic retreat?" The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at the faces of my companions, men who just a few days ago were strangers and were now closer than brothers. Each one bore the marks of battle, not just the physical ones, but the invisible scars that wore imprints on the soul. "We can't move the wounded," Dr. Harrison intervened, his voice exhausted but firm. "A retreat would mean abandoning them to certain death." His words sealed our decision. No Marine leaves a comrade behind. We reorganized our defenses one last time, distributing the few remaining ammunition and positioning our best snipers at strategic points. Rodriguez took command of our front line, his ability to see through the darkness more valuable than ever. The attack began with a mortar barrage more intense than any other we had faced. The air was filled with the sound of explosions and shrapnel cutting through the snow. Martinez coordinated our defense with the same precision as always, ignoring the fever that was now clearly consuming him. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed a change in the sound of the distant fighting. The familiar rumble of American artillery began to echo through the valley, followed by the unmistakable roar of approaching tanks. The reinforcements had finally arrived. The roar of the approaching American tanks was the sweetest music I had ever heard in my life. Even so, the Chinese didn't back down. On the contrary, they intensified their attacks as if determined to eliminate us before rescue arrived. "Hang in there," shouted Martinez, his voice weaker now, but still carrying that authority that had kept us alive for so long. His fever had worsened considerably, and Dr. Harrison was desperately trying to keep him conscious and functional. Rodriguez organized our last line of defense with surprising efficiency. 3 cartridges per man, he announced, distributing our final ammunition. "When it's over, we'll use the bayonets." His eyes, once frightened by the cold, now shone with steely determination. The final attack by the Chinese was unlike anything we had faced so far. They came not in waves, but in a single compact and determined mass. The sound of their bugles had turned into a single continuous war cry that made my bones vibrate. Our rifles fired in perfect sync, each precious shot finding its target. Dr. Harrison had abandoned his position in the makeshift infirmary to join the line of defense, carrying a rifle taken from the hands of a dead comrade. The wounded who could still hold a weapon also took part, turning our last position into a fortress of desperate determination. The sound of American tanks grew closer and closer, but time seemed to drag on. Every second was an eternity of violence and despair. I saw men I had known for years fall beside me, their last moments dedicated to defending our position. Martinez, though seriously wounded, continued to coordinate our defense. "Hold formation," he shouted between fits of coughing. "Don't let them divide us." His leadership, even in that state, was inspiring. Each man was fighting not just for survival, but out of loyalty to a commander who had never abandoned us. When the ammunition ran out, the battle turned primitive and brutal. Bayonets against bayonets, men fighting hand to hand in the bloody snow. Rodriguez proved to be an extraordinary warrior, his technique with the bayonet saving countless lives in our defensive line. It was at that moment that the first Sherman tank broke through the morning mist, its cannons thundering against the Chinese positions. Soon after, more American tanks and infantry appeared, finally forcing the enemy to retreat. The silence that followed was deafening. After so long under constant fire, the absence of gunfire and explosions seemed unreal. I looked around me, at the exhausted, bloodied faces of my fellow survivors. We were only 23 of the 150 who had started the defense. Martinez finally allowed Dr. Harrison to treat him properly. "You're the best men I've ever served with," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll never forget what happened here." They were his last words before losing consciousness. He would survive, but he would never return to the battlefield. The medical teams arrived quickly, beginning the work of evacuating our wounded. Dr. Harrison, after 72 hours of nonstop work, finally allowed himself to rest. Rodriguez helped organize the evacuation, his leadership skills now fully developed through the fire of combat. As I watched the helicopters take off with our wounded, I thought of all the letters I would have to write to the families of Davis, of Collins, of so many others who would not see the end of that battle. The snow continued to fall, gently covering the bodies of the fallen like a white blanket of final peace. 70 years have passed since those days in Chosin. Many of the survivors have already left, taking their stories with them. Rodriguez became a decorated officer, serving with distinction until his retirement. Dr. Harrison continued to save lives as a civilian doctor, always carrying with him the lessons learned during that brutal winter. As for me, I've never been able to look at snow the same way again. Every flake that falls reminds me of those 3 days that forever changed my understanding of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. War takes a lot out of us, but it also teaches us profound truths about human nature, both its darkness and its light. Mary, my fiancée who was waiting in Kansas, became my wife as soon as I returned. Her letters, which kept me sane during those darkest times, I still treasure. Our grandchildren now ask me to tell those stories, and I do, not to glorify the war, but to honor the memory of those who didn't come back. Today, when I get together with the few remaining survivors, we don't talk much about those days. We don't need to. There is a silent understanding between us, a bond forged in the fire of combat and tempered by the cold of chosen. We are the guardians of a story that needs to be remembered, not for the horror of war, but for the greatness of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but for those of us who were there, every moment remains as vivid as if it were yesterday. Especially those 3 days in December 1951, when a small group of Marines proved that courage and determination can overcome even the most impossible odds.